Broadcasting from Washington, D.C., this is Insider's Guide to Energy.
Welcome to Insider's Guide to Energy. I'm your host, Chris Sass, and with me is co-host Jeff McAulay. Jeff, another exciting episode. I think we're talking carbon today.
It's a very interesting topic. I'm always interested in this. Carbon credits, so important. Some controversy as well, so I'm excited to learn more.
I think it's important. I don't know that I've seen it done well yet, and we've had some episodes in the past trying to figure it out. I'm hoping today's episode shed some light on that for us. So I'm going to turn it over to you to get us going.
Yeah, today we are joined by Sunny Trinh, co-founder and CEO of Devvstream. Sunny, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, Sunny, start us off here. What is Devvstream? And tell us more about the business on the day-to-day, how that relates to carbon credits.
Yeah, so Devstream is a company that helps generate streams of revenue for other companies, organizations, or even cities and states through the use of carbon credits. And we focus on technology. And that's part of it is because my background, I have an engineering background, similar to you, Jeff. So in other words, if a company has a technology or doing any activity that helps reduce energy consumption or greenhouse gas emissions, we come in and provide a full turnkey service where we generate and monetize carbon credits for them in exchange for a portion of the credits.
Makes sense. So when we're talking about carbon credits, I always love to clarify upfront. Are we talking about voluntary market, compliance market? How do you characterize the carbon credits that you're generating?
So we participate in both the voluntary and compliance, and we can touch on that in a little bit as well too, because we feel that both are very important in helping address global climate change.
Wonderful. Can you start with some examples, maybe one on each side, one on compliance, one on voluntary?
Sure. So starting with voluntary, as the name implies, it affects organizations who voluntarily decide that they want to reduce their carbon footprint. And that could be because they're getting pressure from their investors or the investor community or their end customers and clients. So when you hear companies like a Google or Microsoft, for example, they're not required or regulated by the government agencies to reduce their carbon footprint. They're doing it because, like I said, they're pressured by the communities outside. And so they voluntarily go and buy carbon credits to reduce their carbon footprint. On the flip side, in the compliance markets, they're in government jurisdictions that require them to meet certain standards. And so usually there's a threshold. So for example, in Canada, most companies, if they're emitting above 50,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year, they get taxed. So anything above that, they can buy carbon credits to help offset that tax.
And in that, so that's an example of a compliance market in Canada. What kind of credits must be purchased in order to comply with that regulatory regime?
So it really depends on the jurisdiction as well too, because every jurisdiction has a different sets of types of credits that are eligible. So for example, in the Alberta TIER program, energy efficiency is one form of credits that are eligible. So if you're doing something for buildings, for example, that reduces your carbon footprint from maybe improve HVAC systems, or you're using LED lighting and switching to that, then that itself, you're reducing energy consumption and hence carbon emissions.
Great. And also just zooming out in this landscape, these carbon credits are, would you also call them offsets?
Sometimes the term is used interchangeably. So You can in this case because you are offsetting some of your emissions by buying these credits, and so you're essentially paying someone to do something good in order for you to offset what you're doing.
Yeah, so just wanted to distinguish between other forms of carbon removal like CDR, direct air capture being separate from what we're talking about.
Yeah, so there's various types of carbon credits, and direct air capture is one form of those credits. Most government jurisdictions don't consider that as eligible for the compliance programs, but direct air capture is widely accepted in the voluntary market, and actually also brings a premium pricing as well too, just because the cost of doing direct air capture is quite expensive.
Great. So orienting us back to carbon credits or offsets in the compliance market, you mentioned Alberta and tier program. And so there are certain types of credits that are eligible, energy efficiency being one of them. How is quality measured in some of those compliance markets?
Yeah. Again, it really depends on the methodologies and the compliance programs. But these type of credits, because they're different from the nature-based credits, the quality are much higher, mainly around the data and the precision of the measurement of the impact. So when you're talking about energy efficiency, for example, you take a look at a building, I can tell you exactly how many kilowatt hours was used before an improvement or upgrade was put in place, and how much improvements there were afterwards. I mean, you just look at the energy bill, right? It's simple as that. Where if you take a look at nature-based projects, well, it's really hard to understand or really measure the impact of 1,000 hectares of forest because trees don't grow linearly. Every season things are different, depending on the water, depending on whether there's pests, and then what happens if there's fires and things like that as well too. And so because technology type credits such as the building efficiency are much more predictable, they're much more precise. That improves the quality because now you really understand the impact.
So you you're given a pretty logical explanation of what's going on, but my experience is carbon credits sometimes are people take them with skepticism and a little bit of a grain of salt. So you're making a logical or compelling case here, but why is that? Why do they get a bad rap today?
Well, now if you kind of take a step back a little bit, and that's a great question, Chris. The carbon credit market is become quite massive, and so it's big. It's become big business, right? So when you look at 2023, for example, it's expected to be 1.16 trillion dollars, and growing to 2.68 trillion by 2028, based on various studies. So whenever there's big business, well, there's going to be folks that are in it not for the right reasons. There's going to be a lot of greed involved. And so you find a lot of project developers who don't follow the certain guidelines. There's no additionality. They create their own registries. They don't do third-party validation. So the market gets flooded with these lower quality credits. And it's like any other industry. You get a few bad apples, it sours it for everybody else, sours the entire barrel. So there are a lot of really good projects and a lot of really good companies doing the right things who is making a true impact. But those few that aren't, well, they get the headlines.
So then I guess why is it different? Why you're a founder of a company doing the same thing? You're one of many kind trying to solve this problem. So what makes your approach different than what others are trying to do?
The main reason is number one, we work again both in the compliance and the voluntary markets. The majority of the lower quality ones are in the voluntary space. We work with the United Nations. We work with various government agencies as well directly. We provide guidance. We have the expertise. So, for example, our head of carbon, David Oliver, he's been asked to lead Canada's National Carbon Association, the first of its kind at the national level. He's also part of several other groups working again with various government jurisdictions, countries, even in provinces. Our chief sustainability officer, Dr. Destiny Knock, she works with governments to help create policies as well too. She's one of our 4 PhDs. And again, I mentioned the fact that we focus on technology. Technology is much more precise, much more predictable, and it's harder to overestimate. I guess when when you look at, like I mentioned before, with buildings, the before and after, we provide that precision and assurance. And the last thing that I'll add too is we have a digital platform that's blockchain based. So all the data used to quantify the credits and all the transactions is fully transparent to everybody. And that's one of the biggest issues of the carbon market is there's a lack of transparency. When you look at some of the projects in developing nations, there's no uh, backup of data or anything like that that shows how the impact and number of credits were generated. I mean, it's for a lot of times it's almost a big guess, and so you kind of have to take a leap of faith saying when you buy these credits, are they actually making an impact? And now we're finding out that some of these large projects aren't. Right. So these are issues that we try to help address while we generate the credits.
Sunny, you said a few key words in your explanation for differentiation. You said guidelines, registries, and my favorite, additionality. Can you just talk through each of those? And also, you mentioned transparency, so I'm assuming that's transparent to some third-party verification.
Yeah, so we'll start with transparency. That's the easiest. It's not just transparency to third-party verifications, but transparent to every stakeholder. So when you're buying a carbon credit right now in the voluntary space, in a lot of projects, it's really hard to get all the data you need in order to say, hey, is this something that is really truly impactful? And I've heard some crazy stories as well too, where with us with our platform, you can dig in as deep as you want, and it's out there wide open. So you can see, hey, how are these measured? What methodology was being used? Um, where was the data before and after, and so forth. So all that's fully available. So you know that the data used to generate the credits is reliable and is accurate. And then as far as additionality, with a lot of technologies, especially ones around energy efficiency and renewables, you know, you and I spoke about this earlier, Jeff, but it was challenging to compete against fossil fuels because fossil fuels are so inexpensive. So what we're doing is we're using carbon credits as a financial vehicle to help advance and really encourage the use of these new technologies and to bridge that gap. And so a lot of the projects we work on, we can show that if we didn't add this carbon credit piece to the financials, these projects would never have happened. So it's very easy to show that additionality just because it helps reduce that cost delta.
That's great. And when you talk about technologies, maybe this is a good time to go into what specifically you mean. And then next, I definitely want to come back to the financing piece.
Sure. Essentially, technology is anything that's engineered or man-made as opposed to nature-based where it revolves around natural resources. So again, I mentioned building efficiency. We have programs for industrial efficiency for factories, for example. It could be low carbon road construction, even something as simple as EV chargers, because they're switching fuel. You're going from gas and carbon based fuels to electric with essentially zero emissions.
Great. And it seems like the baselining may be the hardest part about that. How do you do baselines for all of those, especially if it's over longer periods of time?
Yeah, no, that's actually a really good question, and it's a challenging question. So a lot of that depends on the methodology that we choose in order to generate the credits. So that's developed by NGOs and other organizations on how the baseline is measured and what's considered a baseline. So, for example, in most developed nations, renewable energy such as solar, for example, are eligible for carbon credits anymore because it's widely used. So you kind of lose that additionality. So you lack that baseline. So you're not able to really generate credits because the baseline is so high. But you go into developing nations where it's almost non-existent. Well, the baseline is mainly how much carbon is being generated by the type of energy that they're using. So in like a coal dependent country, well, you have the emissions measured on every kilowatt hour that's being used by the folks in that country. So when you come in with renewable energy, you have that baseline right in place.
Great. And so when we think about the impact of carbon pricing on the financial picture, so pick your favorite project, if that's an EV charger or industrial energy efficiency, what percentage of the CapEx is offset by that carbon revenue stream? And is that upfront at all, or is it more over time?
That's another really good question. It's all over the map. And so it really depends on the type of credits, the quality, and the jurisdiction. So a typical technology credit in the voluntary space that's developed in, say, Canada, for example, um, you would probably generate anywhere between 15 to 30 Canadian dollars per credit. where if you take a look at a voluntary credit, a technology voluntary credit in other jurisdictions, say in the developing nations, you might get $10 to $15, and then you get a nature-based credits. Uh, yeah, depending on whether you're what type of nature-based credits, where it's located, and then whether it's issued by one of the widely accepted registries. So that can range anywhere from $1 to $15, or even less. And then you get into the compliance space. Now it's really all over the map. So on the high end, there's a program called LCFS, or Low Carbon Fuel Standard, in both California and in British Columbia. In California, it's roughly $40 to $80. In British Columbia, it's right around averaging about 450 Canadian dollars. So it's much higher there. So like I said, I mean, it's literally all over the map.
LCFS used to be 200. So this is a compliance market. It's in multiple geographies, and there's some volatility. So when you think about that credit value over time, is anybody locking in a price, or is that volatility exposure on the project?
Yeah, another really good question. So what we're seeing, and we have some agreements with some large global companies as well too, who've given us offtake agreements for over a 3-year period, because companies are trying to lock in, mainly because what they're telling us is that there's a lack of supply in high quality credits in this area. And so I mentioned before, there's a lot of low quality junk credits that are flooding the markets, but at the same time, there's a lack of high quality credits. So we've spoken to multiple companies already that have come back to us and said, yeah, we want to place orders with you now and lock it in for the next several years.
I guess what's a little maybe is more of a layperson or still playing catch up on the carbon markets. Um, what I've heard so far in their dialogue is many different jurisdictions. Even in your company, you've got someone from Canada, you're in the U.S., and then we're talking other jurisdictions, um, and then you know different types and interpretation. So it seems it's a bit of art as opposed to science right now, from what I'm hearing in this conversation. Is that a fair assessment of where we are in the carbon markets? Because it's if you're going to have an impact and a global impact, and the markets are so regional or so different from place to place, it's great that you have it on blockchain and I can go look up any transaction. But if the rules don't apply because I'm sitting in somewhere in another part of the world and we've got different standards or we're a different economy type, how does this really work? I guess I'm not quite picking that up.
Yeah, no, those are really good points. So what the world's trying to do is come up with a more common set of guidelines. And this is happening with the United Nations and how they're bringing people together, especially at the previous COP. The Paris Agreement was signed, and Article 6.2 allows countries to be able to trade credits with each other. And with that comes more specific guidelines. So it is happening where they're trying to create more uniform set of standards. But unfortunately, like you said, there's still a lot of regions that have their own compliance programs. And what we're seeing is there's going to be a merge between the voluntary and the compliance markets, where there are going to be overlap. And hopefully that's enough to create a more specific set of standards that they all kind of fall under. But I mean, that is happening as well too with things like the core carbon principles, where it creates a more, again, precise definition of what high quality credits are. So it is happening, but like any market, it takes time.
So I get that now. I guess when it's early, people could game the system or greenwash or do things because if I can trade carbon credits between locales, that means not all carbon credits are created equal. So I could do some interesting things there. How do you avoid greenwashing type things happening?
Really, it's all around the data and the transparency of the data. How is the impact calculated? What was used to create those numbers, and how easy it is for you to get access to those data? And that's why we really focus on technologies, because again, technology is much easier to create that data and to prove it and to back it up. And also that's why we created a type of platform that makes everything transparent, so you can see all of that. And that's why we're getting companies approaching us saying we want your credits, because of all these things that we're addressing.
When we think about from a consumer perspective, I think I've personally bought carbon credits in the past. if I'm an individual listening to this and I'm inspired and I want to go buy credits, how should I think about finding and identifying a high quality credit if I'm not ready to go through all of the advanced analysis that you're going through?
I would say the first thing is to make sure that the credits are validated and verified by a third party. You'd be surprised how many projects where they validate their own credits, which is kind of like printing your own money in my eyes. So that's the first step. And the second one is to make sure that if it's a voluntary credit that they're looking at buying, which most cases that's what individuals would have to do, it's registered with one of the widely accepted registries, and that it's issued and certified by them as well too. And there's a handful, so that includes Gold Standard, Vera, Global Carbon Council, American Carbon Registry. So just to name a few.
Great. And you said third party verified and registries. Are the registries the same as the third party verifiers, or are those different?
Oh no, they're different. The registries, the way to look at it, they kind of police all the steps, and they're the ones that actually issue the credits. And then, in order for them to issue the credits, there are certain third-party verifiers and validators that are on their approval list that they have to go through the process, so they know that these are folks that can be trusted. They're not going to come up with some crazy numbers, overestimation. So, and again, keep in mind that it's still not perfect. Even going through that process, you're still going to get some issues with overestimations, things like that. But at least you check the majority of the boxes that this is something that's legitimate. And also, if you're looking at reselling it, then you're going to find buyers for it. Where if you don't follow these steps, again, there's a flood of credits that companies and organizations aren't willing to buy because they don't meet these criteria.
Yeah. Can you just give some examples of the third party verifiers, like a Green E, or who would you?
Yeah, like a Ruby Canyon, SES. They're, I mean, these are companies that aren't really household names, right? But the best thing to do is go to the registries, and then like you can look up Vera, for example, and then they'll list the type of validators and verifiers that they accept. But I would say you don't necessarily even need to go that far. If you find credits that are on these registries, that means that they were verified or validated by organizations that were approved by them. Otherwise, they would have issued the credits in the first place. Just to make it a little simpler for individuals.
And then on the other side, on a personal journey, I'm checking out an airline and it says offset your carbon associated with this flight. If I don't see one of those things, should I be skeptical? Are there other warning signs that it might be a low quality credit?
Uh, Gosh, that's a really good question. It's all over the map. Just because somebody says that, and like an airline says that you can offset your flight because we have carbon credits, doesn't necessarily mean that they're buying high quality credits. So this kind of goes back to what I'm saying about the lack of transparency. You don't know what type of credits they're buying. There's one airline that's in the news that is getting sued, civil action suit, because of the credits that they're buying that supposedly is offsetting the carbon, and it's not, right? So these are things you still have to be careful of, because again, it's hard to find the data and keep digging, and most people don't have the time to do that anyways. And that's why we want to create that transparency, so that way it's very easy that people see, hey, these credits were generated by this efficiency project in Canada, where this company wouldn't have switched over to this improved process if they didn't have that additional money. All right. So these are things that are important that, again, it's really hard to find right now.
Great. Buyer beware in all markets for all things, and especially this one. But it's good to hear that there's signals, third party verifiers, standards where at least there's an attempt to be above board. Can we go back to something that you mentioned before, which was the international process? And you said that there's a potential merger between the voluntary and compliance market. Can you say more about what that might look like?
Yeah. So I mentioned before that, in the last COP, what was called the Paris Agreement was signed, and specifically Article 6.2, where countries are now able to trade credits with each other. So what that means is that there's countries with compliance programs and there's countries that don't have compliance programs. Well, those credits are becoming more and more interchangeable as long as they meet certain criteria. And this is really important because where a lot of the money that needs to go to in order to support and really address global climate change are developing nations. And these developing nations, they're the ones that don't have much emissions, but they're getting the blunt of the all the issues with global climate change. So by being able to trade their credits specifically into developed nations, the money's flowing to them more directly, and it also assures that the credits that they generate will meet these more specific, more stringent guidelines as well too. So as countries trade with each other, voluntary credits will be traded into compliance spaces as well too, and vice versa. And that's where you start seeing more of a merger, and also becomes more of a global market, a more unified market, as opposed to dozens and dozens of different regional markets.
One of the other criticisms on carbon offsets is that it's permission to continue to emit rather than changing broader fuel sources or as opposed to more permanent removal. Do you have any thoughts on that and how it fits into the broader decarbonization landscape?
I think what you're saying is valid, and in a lot of cases, when you're talking about the bad players, that is absolutely the case. However, a lot of these companies who are voluntarily buying carbon credits, they're still doing these things regardless of whether there's a carbon credit market or not. At least with a carbon market, they're funneling some of the money and from their profits into projects and other activities that are helping mitigate these emissions. And so without that, you wouldn't have that extra piece. So it's say it's. And I'm not saying it's perfect because there's still a lot of places where they're buying cheap credits and it's really not creating that impact. And so yeah, they're allowed to continue to do what they're doing. But my argument is that they're still going to do it anyways, right? And like anything else, if you want the world to move, you have to create an economic incentive. And this is that economic incentive. Otherwise, yeah, you'll get a few companies do a little bit here and there, but not to the point where we need it to be. I mean, if you take a look at the numbers, Jeff. So again, studies have been done, and in order for us to even get close or to meeting our net zero goals at a global level, we got to get to a point where we're reducing carbon emissions by 23 billion tons per year of CO2 by 2030. And in order to do that, I mean, it's estimated that roughly 12 and a half of that 23 billion tons needs to be driven by carbon credits. Without it, we don't have that even a remote chance to even meet that. So yes, there's a lot of negative things about it, but it's still really critically important.
And I guess as this is maturing, you're talking to us generally about carbon credits. You're stepping into the company you started. You mentioned blockchain is something that you're hanging your hat on because of the transparency. I guess how do you envision this working forward? Are folks going to be tied into a common system? Is there a bunch of APIs that folks traders will now have, or where does this become part of the workflow down the road when this gets more established, assuming it takes off?
Yeah. So there's several aspects of that question that I'll kind of address one by one. The biggest piece, like I mentioned before, is lack of transparency for all the stakeholders who are looking to buy the credits. They don't know where the credits come from, how it's calculated, and so forth. And having a platform that allows them to see that quickly and easily helps address that. So that's what we do, and blockchain allows that as well too. Where if there's any changes, it'll get captured in the blockchain in
How,
any of the
how does
blocks.
that work? You gave the example of if I'm using an environmental one, let's say I buy rights to 100 acres of forest to sequester or capture the carbon, right? So that's my strategy. And it gets logged or it gets fire comes in, burns it down. A human still needs to add that to the blockchain, though, right? It doesn't just automatically happen.
Correct. You still need to add that. So that's part of the credits we generate is that all these projects, when these things happen, the data goes into our blockchain. Where up to this point, it's a very antiquated system on a lot of these registries where data is kept on spreadsheets, for example, or private databases. And so unless you go and do a lot of investigative work, you're not going to be able to find that. And most people aren't going to do that. Where with ours, as soon as you go into our system, again, you can find all this valid information or relevant information, I should say, and be able to really understand whether this is a credit worth buying or not. Or is this one that's creating the impact you're looking for? So it's just a matter of how easy it is to get access to information and even the availability. Sometimes the information I'm talking about with some credits, they're not even available.
All right. So from what I just heard you say, basically, I need some carbon credits or I'm looking at a deal, I'm structuring something. So I log into some sort of application, check out to see the specifics of the one I want, and then that's how this works. Then it's not something in the part of the workflow. It's actually another step in the due diligence, is what I'm hearing.
In the due diligence, yeah. And what you'll see is every transaction around those credits will be stored on blockchain as well too, because one of the other issues that we've run into is what's called double counting, where you have a company who sells a credit and at the same time they retire a credit, or they sell to two different parties at the same time. When you're doing things manually, there's no way you can track if it's being sold to multiple parties at the same time. On a blockchain, you'll see it immediately.
Who maintains this blockchain, right? So one of the challenges of blockchain is, they're sometimes expensive to operate and they have to be kept up and running. So how does this live in perpetuity once the deal's done? How do I know it's going to stay out there?
Yeah, so one of our sister companies that we spun off from is a blockchain company called Devvstream, and it's a proprietary blockchain that is much less expensive than any other ones in the world. For example, the cost per transaction is 1/10 millionth that of Ethereum. So it's not nearly anywhere near as expensive, and it's got the lowest carbon footprint of any blockchain by orders of magnitude. So we didn't want to use an energy intensive blockchain because it kind of defeats the purpose. All right. So we have this. So all the credits that we generate will be on this blockchain. We maintain it, and because of the way it's structured, we're not concerned about the cost or energy consumption as well. And so unless it's widely adopted, yes, is it going to be a huge impact in the industry? Well, we hope so, and we hope so by starting with the projects that we work on and using that. And like you said, uh, one of the beauties of this blockchain too is it connects to anything else through RESTful APIs. So it addresses a lot of those issues. And then the other thing that I'll bring up as well as the benefit of this is it improves the process and makes it much more efficient. Because today the process of generating credits is all done manually, and it could take anywhere between 12 months to 36 months just to get a project through. Ultimately, what we want is to be able to have the project developers connect directly into our platform, and all the data flows directly there, and then we connect directly into the registries. So it becomes almost real time. And our goal is within a year is to move this 12 to 36-month process and make it almost within days.
It sounds really inspiring. And in terms of where the market is going, you've talked about greater fungibility, transferability, and potentially more of a global market. Some things, though, may not be as transferable, and I'm thinking about co-benefits. So there's more to these projects than just carbon. How do you think about co-benefits from a buyer's perspective and where they might be interested in more local or other degrees of impact, local air quality, jobs, other potential co-benefits?
That's a great question. And we actually keep track of that on all our credits. So it is all that data will be on the blockchain as well too. And also that's what increases the value of the credits. If these are things like maybe an indigenous population is helping the group there, or it's helping women, for example, we work with a group called WOCAN that looks at the impact on women for some of these projects, and they have a what's called a W plus credit that can be tied to these carbon credits as well. Because what people don't realize in a lot of developing nations, women are the ones in within most family organizations that kind of lead the work process, and they're the ones that get the least amount of benefits. So adding this piece to it ensures that some of the money flows to them as well too, and also highlights the impact that it creates. So I mean that's a really important point, Jeff, that you brought up, and we add that into our credits. And so what I mentioned the transparency. That's also part of the transparency. Plus, it helps meet a lot of the UN SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, as well. So we keep track of which SDGs our projects address, and we add that to our data.
Wonderful. Well, Sunny, I think we covered just about everything, the veritable bingo board of carbon markets, important concepts, right? We talked about compliance, additionality, double counting, verifiability, fungibility, transparency, co-benefits, all of the really important concepts. So you've navigated across all of those. It's been really great to have this conversation, acknowledging some of the challenges, but it sounds really exciting where it can go from here. So really, thank you very much for the time today. It was a great discussion.
Well, it's been another exciting interview here on Insider's Guide to Energy. We hope you understand a little bit more about what's happening with carbon. If you've enjoyed this content in this episode, please don't forget to subscribe. Don't forget to find us on YouTube. We have a YouTube channel. You can watch this content as well. And if you like the content, share it with your friends. And we'll see you again next time on the Insider's Guide to Energy podcast. Bye-bye.